While visiting Lisbon, you really should take a short trip along the waterfront district of Belém to enjoy one of the most spectacular sights, the Jeronimos Monastery, built 500 years ago in the Portuguese Gothic style called Manueline. Jeronimos Church is not only a magnificent late Gothic structure, but it's the most important historical landmark from 500 years ago when Portugal was one of the most powerful countries on the planet. And so the church today stands as the major symbol and reminder about those past glory days of this nation. They say this church was made out of black pepper because of all of the wealth that Portugal gained from sale of this really important spice. 500 years ago, Portugal ranked among the world's most powerful and wealthiest nations because of their discoveries that led to colonization and control of Brazil and parts of Africa, India, and early trade relations with China and Japan and the Spice Islands. This enabled Portugal to have a monopoly on the import of spices, which were critical for food preservation, which made Portugal extremely rich. Walking through the church is a goosebump experience brought on by the astonishing, lofty interior space. Supported by tall columns that soar heavenward and spread like trees in branching stone ribs at the top, forming a delicate tracery pattern on the ceiling. The many Gothic arches are lined with twisted stone carved to look like sailors' ropes. Several notable tombs inside include Vasco da Gama, King Manuel, and other royals. The church was so solidly constructed that it survived the Great Earthquake of 1755, even though the adjacent monastery was destroyed and then later rebuilt in the original style. Our local guide Isabel fills us in with some of the fascinating history associated with the Jeronimos Monastery.
Okay, here we are now in front of the church of the Saint Jerome Monastery, or Jeronimos Monastery in Portuguese, which was built in the 16th century by King Manuel I to replace the small chapel that existed here before. That small chapel was not big enough for everybody, and that's when our king decided to build the big church with an adjoining monastery. Now, King Manuel I was nicknamed the Lucky King because he was the one who had all the money coming from the spice trade and he just had to spend it. The other kings before him had to invest a lot of money trying to get to India, trying to discover the sea route to India. So he built this monastery with the money of the pepper tax. It was really important for the sailors to attend Mass before leaving to the sea voyages because they knew that a great percentage of these sailors would die. There was also a great percentage of ships that just sank because there were big storms. So imagine to be one of these sailors embarking in one of these ships and not knowing if they were going to come back to their homes and see their families again, or if they were going to have an accident on board and died, or a disease like scurvy. And so for them was very important to pray and ask the protection of Our Lady. So inside the church, if you take a look to the walls, you are going to see the same type of decoration I showed you outside. So the carvings on the stone, they all represent vegetalistic motifs, seaweeds, flowers, leaves, even tropical fruits like pineapples that were unknown to the Europeans until the Portuguese brought them in their vessels. And you can see the ropes again, you see on the arch, the rope. So the rope is always present in this type of decoration that is named Manueline style after the name of the King Manuel. Now here we have the tomb of Vasco da Gama. So Vasco da Gama was the Portuguese navigator who made the first trip to India, sailing off from Western Europe, from Lisbon. He arrived there in 1498, and this was considered to be a very, very important achievement. The Europeans needed to buy the spices from India, so the spices used to be transported from India across Asia, the Middle East, the Mediterranean to Venice. And in Venice, they were then exported to the Western European countries. So everybody involved in the transportation by land of the spices from India to Venice wanted to make money out of it, obviously. Every time there was a new shipment of spices arriving in Venice, the price was going up and up and up. And this was really unbearable for the European economies. The European countries depended a lot on the spices. This was the only way they had to preserve the fresh food, the meat and the fish, because the spices have an antiseptical property that keeps the bacteria away. So it was very important for the Europeans to buy the spices, and all the people involved in the transportation, involved in this business, knew how important it was for the Europeans to get the spices. So they just raised the prices as they wanted. They wanted to make good money out of it. And that's why the Europeans wanted desperately to find the sea route to get to India, to be able to get there, buy the spices and bring them directly to Western Europe. So the Portuguese were the first to do that in 1498. And the first shipment of spices brought in by Vasco da Gama from India to Lisbon arrived here 40% cheaper than the spices were sold in Venice. And this was really what the success of the trip, the success of the discovery of the sea route to India, was getting the spices much cheaper than here in Lisbon. Portugal had then the monopoly of the spice trade, where the Portuguese ships going to India and bringing the spices over to Lisbon, and from here then they were exported to the other European countries. And this was the first economical boom in Portugal. That was what we call the first golden age for Portugal, because we had all this money coming in. And so Manuel I was the king at that time, so he was nicknamed the Lucky One. So he was the one who was the ruler of the country when it was easy to rule the country, because the money was coming in. And as a result, so he built beautiful buildings, but unfortunately most of them were destroyed by the earthquake. So Vasco da Gama, he made several trips between Lisbon and India. He died over there. He died in India, he was buried there in a church, and just a couple of years after his death, the Portuguese decided to bring his remains to Portugal. And he was buried in the south of the country, in a small town where he was born. It was only in the 1800s, the 19th century, that the Portuguese government decided to bring the remains of Vasco da Gama from his hometown to this church. This is the only church we have in Lisbon from the 16th century, and so they wanted to have the tomb of Vasco da Gama here. And they decorate the tomb with these carvings in order to match the carvings of the church. So they have here the rope, and the rope there, the flowers, so the vegetalistic motifs. And here in the center, you have a Portuguese caravel. This ship was designed by the Portuguese, and the reason why were the Portuguese the first to get to India in 1498 is because the Portuguese had better ships, better equipment, and better maps.
After visiting the church, you want to visit the adjacent cloister. There's a slight admission charge, but it's well worth it, as we find out with our guide Isabel.
So here we are now in the cloister of the monastery. As you probably know, all the monasteries and convents have a cloister, and they are always very nice, pretty places, because in the past, most of the religious orders, once the nuns or the monks joined the order and they went to a convent or to a monastery, they could not leave the building for their lifetime, and they could not receive visitors. Not even their family could visit them there. They had no contact with the outside world, only with the monks or nuns living in the same building. So for them to have a place with fresh air, with sun, was very important. And that's why the cloisters were not the playground, but the only place where they could spend their free time and have some contact with the nature and with the sunlight and with fresh air. So they were always pretty places. And when they were going to build a new monastery or a new convent, the first thing to do was to choose the best part of the property to have the cloister. They wanted the cloister to have as much sun as possible during the day, so to have sun from sunrise to sunset. After deciding where the cloister was going to be built, they would decide where to build the church, and afterwards, so the rest of the building. So this cloister was built in two phases, like the church we just visited. The first floor where we are, this first level, was built by the architects of King Manuel. So we see here the carvings, the vegetalistic motifs, everything I showed you already in the church. Now, the second level, the upper level, was finished at the end of the 16th century, like the main chapel we saw in the church. But the architect who worked here was not the same who worked at the main chapel. And this one did a decoration in order to match with what was already done downstairs. Now, if you look with attention, if you look careful to the upper gallery, you see some medallions. That is a Renaissance element, not existing in the Manueline decoration. And then you can see some carvings on the stone around the arches, not as detailed as downstairs, meaning that architect, he also used some Renaissance elements that were in fashion all over Europe, but at the same time he wanted to do something so to match with the Manueline decoration downstairs. So if I didn't say anything to you when you arrive here, you don't really notice the difference. But then looking careful, we see that the decoration upstairs is simpler, is less elaborated than the one downstairs. There is a lavabo with a lion. So the lion used to have water coming out of his mouth, and that was the place where the monks used to wash their hands and faces before they would go to the dining room. And there is a big room that was the dining room of the monks. If you want to have a look inside, you will see some beautiful tiles from the 16th century, and there is no table anymore, no chairs, but you can see the long room and the beautiful tiles. Okay, so here we are in the refectory of the monks, or the dining room of the monks. So they had here very long wooden tables, very long benches, and they would have their meals here. So the tiles we can see here go back to the 16th century when the building was built, and they do represent some religious scenes from the Bible. When you get the top of the staircase, if you turn left, you have the choir of the church, from where you have a very beautiful view over the nave and the main chapel. It's a very nice perspective of the church.
We have many more movies about Lisbon, which you can see on our YouTube channel. If you enjoy our programming, please subscribe and share it with your friends, and comments are always welcome. Thanks very much.